Please join me in welcoming and thanking all of our speakers today.
Well, thank you for that kind invitation. As we begin our discussion today of this intriguing murder case, I would like to ask Mr. Bryson to set the scene for us at Uluru as this event begins to unfold.
Thank you. Is my voice carrying? As I've said before, and I do like to begin this way, I hate being involved with addresses or lectures in which the audience leaves knowing less than they came in with. So if I'm not being clear, please tell me. The scenario for those of you who are not really familiar with this case, I should set. To introduce the Chamberlain family, please visualise Azaria, an 8 weeks old baby, when not feeding, is most often asleep in a small bassinet. Brother Reagan, 4, Brother Aidan, 6, Mother Lindy, dark bobbed hair, slim figure, considered very pretty. Father Michael, short, athletic, very handsome, blonde, a young pastor of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. His parish is a large mining town in the north, famous for its copper. Copper is a valuable asset to all the population there. Traces of copper in the open air on windy days can cause coughing and can stain washing picked on hoists caught out in a rainstorm. Copper will also become the subject of a warning given to an inquiry into the Chamberlain case by the German manufacturers of blood identification tests, that contamination by copper may produce a positive reaction in tests, as if confirming the presence of blood. Now, to place us in the landscape, please imagine a vast, red, sandy plain, annual rainfall less than 5 inches, so some saltwater, small trees widely spaced, spiky grass bushes. Those of you familiar with the sands of Utah will come close. Like most deserts, mid-afternoon may boil, nights may freeze, and this is December, our high summer. 3 small motels are allowed here, but most tourists camp out. Many hundreds of tourists are here right now, in caravans, in converted autobuses, in tents. And close by stands the reason everyone is here. Ayers Rock, or Uluru, a monolith of sandstone 1,000 feet high, 6 miles around, red and glowing at sunrise and at sunset. The Chamberlain family, in a compact 5-seater, arrived here around midday, set up their small tent, drove to a face of the rock where Michael and the boys climbed this face. Then Michael again climbing, this time carrying, it was said, the baby Azaria, as these earliest rumours had it, whom he then slaughtered on the peak to atone for the sins of the world. Belief in this scenario did not last long, did not survive the discovery of a pair of elderly ladies, Florence Wilkin and Gwen Eccles, who dandled a live Azaria on their knees while the father was climbing high above. When evening fell, most campers were at their campfires or at the communal gas barbecues. These were holiday makers, but the Chamberlains, as the nation would come to believe, were not. Their religious duty called for the sacrifice of baby Azaria here because the babe was a devil's child, and true, she did projectile vomit once or twice at home. So her mother dressed her in black. True, she did have one black smock, a hand-me-down from her brother Reagan, or because she was brain damaged by a fall from a shopping trolley. True, she did fall, but was undamaged. And in their faraway home was an infant's tiny coffin. But this was used by the pastor in his lectures against tobacco, vivid as a disturbing prop. For all or for some of these reasons, her mother was said to have laid the baby down in her basket inside the small tent. The parents ate a small meal with other campers at the barbecue. While the night darkened, they could hear the wild dogs we call dingoes skulking just beyond the light of campfires, and they planned then and there how best to decapitate their baby daughter and pretend she was taken off by a band of dingoes. At their trial for murder, the prosecutors were able to prove by highly scientific testing the mother had left the barbecues to check on their baby, took her from the basket into the car, and with a pair of nail scissors took off the baby's head, secreted the little body in an empty camera bag on the car floor, returned to the barbecue, again to the tent, seconds later screamed, "A dingo's got my baby." Their car, years later, would be shown by these technicians to be awash with blood. In 1982, Lindy Chamberlain began her life sentence for murder. Every lay witness, led by those who were with her at the campsite, organised public rallies in protest against the conviction. The trial judge retired from law eventually to campaign for the abolition of juries in murder cases. The true happenings of that night were as the Chamberlains and those at the campsite with them said it was. The event had begun months earlier, before the baby Azaria was even conceived. the chief ranger at Ayers Rock wrote to his superiors, warning of danger from the current dingo pack, warning that small children and babies could be considered possible prey. His letter was never acknowledged. When Lindy Chamberlain screamed and the cry went out, hundreds of campers spilled out into the night plain, searching with torches. Aboriginal trackers holding flame sticks because their light on marks in the sand was truer. Spurts of blood stained the tent. Dingo tracks surrounded it. Two trackers followed the tracks of a dingo carrying a bundle, rested the bundle on the sand for a moment, then carried on. That tracker, Minion Terry, pointed at the mark and said softly, "Baby, not move anymore." On this plain, on this night, everyone knew what had happened here. The rangers, the trackers, the hundreds of searching campers, all of them were clear in their understanding. A pack of dingoes had made off with the baby. How a group of politicians, of lawyers, of police and bureaucrats managed their successful conviction of the parents for murder provides the most shameful episode in our legal history.
Thank you for those vivid images of that evening at Uluru. And I want to start our discussion of how this case moved in the direction that it did by looking at some of those final words that you just uttered. That on that evening, everyone knew what had happened. Everyone knew that a pack of dingoes had taken this child. How is it that we moved from that interpretation of events to a focus on the Chamberlains and an environment of growing suspicion that perhaps instead of that version of the tale, a more elaborate version that included the mother, Lindy Chamberlain, killing the child was perhaps more plausible? How did that occur here?
Yes. And let me explain the politics of that region. It is a region predominantly of Aboriginal folk, their camps, their country. Because it is rich in minerals, particularly that reason, I think, it is attractive to opportunistic white professionals who come in, mostly lawyers, but doctors and bureaucrats, who come in and make a great deal of money feeding their inevitable superannuation, and then they leave again to retire back where they came from. The only people there, by a long shot, who are born in that territory, live in that territory, die in that territory, are the Aboriginals. So commercially, it's a very opportunistic circumstance for white professionals. They form a dominant and what would you say, a dominant and cohesive group. It's a club, mostly male in those days. It was where the power lay. When the Chamberlains were waiting at the scene 2 days after the baby's disappearance. The investigation had been taken over from the local police to incoming professionals from elsewhere. This was also the arrival of the first of the southern journalists. The original pair or three of the journalists were very sceptical about the claim of the parents that the child had been taken by a pack of dingoes. There was a late night drinking session in one of the motels there between investigating police and the incoming journalists. The journalists were attempting to persuade the police that the claimed happenings were an impossibility, that dingoes had never been known to take a child before. Turned out to be wrong, but it was the belief at the time. So heated did the argument become that one of the intoxicated journalists found a plastic bucket, filled it with sand, and brought it back to the others, saying, "This is the weight, 10 pounds of that baby. Hold it in your own jaws and see if you can." You can't think really of a more ridiculous way to test a hypothesis, but it worked. The meeting dissolved in laughter. People went back to their rooms, but the seed of distrust of the Chamberlains had been sown, and really snowballed from there. So disgusted was the first coroner who sat on the hearing of the death of the baby about the rumours that were racing around the nation, that, for example, the name Azaria biblically meant sacrifice in the wilderness, a rumour that had come from the Chamberlain's hometown, from a medical practitioner of a rival religion. In fact, he missed the true one. And there was a name in the dictionary of names that he proffered. Azazel was the one he should have picked up on. Azaria was in fact listed in that book as God's little helper. So the rumours abounded. Death threats were made against the Chamberlains. I remember one particular, they ought to burn the bitch, was one. Bombs were said to have been planted in the courthouse, which meant an evacuation of the first hearing. And so disgusted was that coroner with the behaviour of the nation that he invited in the cameras television cameras to record his findings. His findings was that the happenings were exactly as the Chamberlains and the eyewitnesses said it was. A dingo pack had taken away the child. He castigated the press. More lastingly, in a sense, he castigated the government department in charge of parks in that area for having ignored the warnings from their own people. Really, as a result of that, it later became a political issue. And looking at this case, the behaviour of media reporting every one of the unfounded rumours throughout the nation had an extraordinarily far-reaching effect. Quickly, the nation became convinced that the Chamberlains had slaughtered their baby. It was far-reaching enough that when the new investigation was successful in bringing the Chamberlains to trial, everyone wondered how a jury, an unbiased jury, could be assembled. And really, it proved to be a very cunning trick. If you don't have the evidence sufficient to convict, a very scurrilous but effective way is simply by using the effect of media to manage public opinion. Just convince the country that she's guilty. Never mind about the evidence. Will make no difference. And in fact, we saw a trial in which all of the media changed their position, having heard all the evidence from technicians, scientists from Scotland Yard, for example, that a stain on the baby's singlet was made of a bloody human hand. In fact, if you looked at that human hand, it was a strange hand. It had 6 digits. The rest of us are blessed only with 5. Other aspects of spurious science abounded. The cuts in the baby's jumpsuit were said to have been made by scissors and not by canine teeth. Later proved to be quite wrong. Some of the most spectacular dealt with blood. For example, blood that was proven, as it turned out, to be not only human blood, but the blood of an infant, fetal blood, found in the back seat of the Chamberlain's car a year later, was later proved to be the spill of an old milkshake. The famous arterial spray, which was found in the leg tunnel of the car in the passenger seat side, which was proved to be an arterial spurt from the baby's very last heartbeats as the mother cut her head off with a pair of nail scissors, turned out later to have been a sound deadening emulsion sprayed on during the car's manufacture by General Motors called Dewfix 101. The point really with pre-trial prejudicial publicity of this enormity is that it reaches not only to shape the opinion of a public, it shaped the opinion of the scientists And later, during the several appeals up the appellate train after the conviction, you can see that it shaped also the opinion of the appeals judges. For example, the most extraordinary was from a federal court judge whose judgment can be reduced to this: I cannot allow the questioning of the evidence in this case because the accused murdered her baby. So the reach of emotional opinion and prejudice was unprecedented in our country.
So, in this case, you've given us a lot to think about, right? We in the United States have experienced a number of criminal prosecutions that have received the kind of media attention that you described in the Lindy Chamberlain case from Australia. And we've dealt with some of these same issues, the idea of how do we secure a jury that's not prejudiced? How do we deal with scientific evidence that may or may not be as accurate as we believe? We like to think, of course, that the science is perfect that we offer in court, but we continue to find, as we begin to look more and more closely at the evidence, that sometimes we've engaged in scientific practices that aren't actually as accurate as we might think, and rather simply confirm what we've already believed, which again sounds very similar to what happened in this case. Let me ask you a question about the media in general, and that is, knowing that the media will be present and that we as a population are looking for media attention on cases like this because these are of great interest to us, how do we deal with that? How do we grapple with the issues that the media creates? What are the lessons that we can learn from the Chamberlain case? And one in particular that I would ask about is, the Chamberlain case is an example where we see cameras in the courtroom. And of course, we've seen that in high-profile cases in the US as well, most notably, of course, the O.J. Simpson case, which was televised internationally. What do you think about the idea of cameras in the courtroom, and what other lessons can we take as we try to move forward in this reality where we do have a criminal justice system that is going to be influenced, that is going to include the media in some ways?
Yes. It took a while, but over the next 2 years, in fact, while Lindy Chamberlain was still in jail, there was a ground shift in the sympathies of the media, and perhaps this was simply because controversy sells newspapers. But it did happen, and it was to some extent, once the media picked up the groundswell elsewhere amongst the rest of us, that distrusted the proceedings and the way it had been successful. That new bias in the media was a great help to move along the momentum for a new inquiry. And I think that the more scepticism we're able to hold on to as a public, of course, the better. When DNA evidence, which wasn't available at the time of this case, but was on the horizon, when it made its first impact on trials, particularly criminal trials, it was thought to be the answer which embodied all truth. That phase in my country lasted about 12 months until gradually cases which relied on DNA assessment were shown to be fallacies. And I think we've seen a good deal of that in this country too. Certainly where it is the purpose of a prosecution to replace the human evidence with theoretical and experimental evidence, we shouldn't allow that.
So in a story like this one, there's not going to be any happy ending, but there is some closure for Lindy Chamberlain and the Chamberlain family. Tell us, if you would, what eventually happened in this case, including just a few years ago, even though it's been decades since this event unfolded. And in doing so, share with us what the current perception of the Chamberlain family and Lindy Chamberlain is in Australia. Do people still question whether she was involved, or had they come to accept the truth that the criminal justice system, at least, has come to accept, that this was, as it originally appeared, an attack by dingoes at Ayers Rock at Uluru?
Yes, interestingly, really, culture determines a great deal. I like to think that personality determines everything except for those determinations that are cultural. Because the answer to this now is regional. Outside the territory of these happenings, overwhelmingly now the public recognise that the culprit was a pack of dingoes and that the parents were innocent. Go back to where the trial happened in that part of the Australian territory. It had become an article of communal faith to believe that the police had been right all the time, that she should have been convicted, and talking to police, some police there even today, and I should say this is predominantly a male pattern. Talking to police there today, we can still find those who will say, look, we know more than we could possibly put into the public arena. I don't think, we're best off thinking of those personalities as sharing a lot with our common cockroach. Been around a long time, so thick-skinned you would never change their opinion, and feed on detritus. Now, that class of northern white will never change. The women have. Tragically, the Chamberlains had to go through 4 inquests, each replacing the other, before the official record of the cause of death was brought in as an attack from wild dingoes. The third coroner, a man, a lawyer of course, and a member of the local professional clubby community, was asked to follow the finding of the Commission of Inquiry which exonerated the Chamberlains. Now, one would have thought that as a matter of following the rules of authority, that it would be incumbent on him to do that. He refused and left it as what we call an open finding, which essentially says we can't tell what happened, despite the rulings then of the Commission of Inquiry and the Court of Criminal Appeal, which then followed that and quashed the conviction. That upset the Chamberlains a great deal and upset their supporters, of course. But he couldn't bring himself to follow the path of reasonable justice and go against his community's faith in the original convictions. Come the fourth inquest, we had a different generation of lawyer as the coroner, and we had a jump in gender. She was a woman. It was saddening, but giving us a revival of belief in the possible goodness of human nature, that in delivering her finding that the baby had been taken off and killed by a pack of dingoes, she could not finish her finding other than in tears. Of course, we were all in tears, but for the judge also, we thought that was pretty good.
Well, I think it reiterates the points that you're making earlier about us being cautious and skeptical with regards to the media's influence in these cases, because even after an exoneration, and even after now the final coroner's inquest determining definitively that it was as it originally appeared, that this was a death by a pack of dingoes, that there is still, because of that early involvement of the media and all of those rumors that were being circulated about the case that proved to be untrue, there is still, at least in some groups in Australia, some doubt about whether this actually was a pack of dingoes or whether Lindy Chamberlain may truly have been involved, which of course we know she was not based on all the evidence that's been revealed, but yet that is a lingering effect of the early media involvement. Before we move to questions and talk a little bit more about this case, let me invite Professor Erica Nichols-Cook to the podium to speak briefly about the Innocence Project in the United States and the links between the media and issues of wrongful conviction here.
That better? Will be? Okay, thank you so much. There are so many striking similarities between the Lindy Chamberlain case and the innocence movement, and the cases that we talk about, the cases that students work on. In my mind, I drew so many parallels to the West Memphis 3. Show of hands. And a few. Okay, so take my class. The change in science, the change in prosecutors, the change in the public perception, the conviction in the newspapers, which is now Facebook and Twitter, right? How many of you have had to defend the Brendan Dassey opinion to your friends and family? Couple, right? How many of you have been accosted by, say, your hairdresser because Casey Anthony was found not guilty? Right? I don't know how long I sat there trying to explain the burden of proof beyond reasonable doubt to someone who was so convinced by Nancy Grace that Casey Anthony was a murderer. So there were so many great lessons to be learned from the Lindy Chamberlain case and Mr. Bryson's book here that you as future lawyers are going to encounter. You know, the rules of ethical professional responsibility, they limit what you can say about your client, about your case. You can't just go out and explain why your client's innocent, because you might taint that jury pool. And the rules of ethics say you can't necessarily do that. In the innocence movement, I think we've made great strides in helping to change that public perception that occurs, that everyone who's been convicted is guilty, and lock them up and throw away the key. We've illustrated some of the mistakes with DNA, with hair analysis, shaken baby cases, arson cases, all the junk science that you see illustrated in this movie, in this book. It's still happening today. We're still uncovering those things, and we're still trying to change that public discourse. And I feel like every day you're working to reinforce that presumption of innocence, because the media takes it away from you. And so those are just some things to think about. The innocence movement is varied, right? We're not one cohesive project. Here, we're partnered with the Illinois Innocence Project, which is a part of a member of the national network, which was started by O.J. Simpson's lawyer, Barry Scheck, and Peter Newfield in New York. We're connected to them. We're not funded by them or governed by them. There are other groups like the Exoneration Project at the University of Chicago that handle different types of cases. And each state, and there's some states without any. So I think one of the greatest lessons you can take from today is that in your role as future advocates and members of the bar is to work to restore that presumption of innocence and combat those armchair juries, those Facebook lawyers, to remind them what's at stake here is potentially someone's life, and they shouldn't be deciding guilt or innocence from their computer. They're not the jury, they're not the judge. Laura Meiskop-Mueller, stand up. She is one of the Illinois Innocence Project attorneys who's been working with students this year on some DNA cases. And so she will be here, and I will be here afterwards for a while. If you have any questions or you want to talk about the externship experience. I also have a couple of alum students here and some current students. So we get very passionate and could talk for a long time about the similarities between Lindy Chamberlain's tragic experience and those of our clients. But I don't want to take up too much time, so I will turn it back over for questions, and then we'll be around if you want to talk.
Thank you very much. So we do have just a few minutes for a couple of questions. Does anybody have a question? Yes, please.
You mentioned in the makeup of the area where this all occurred that a large proportion of the population is Aboriginal. I was just wondering if it affected sort of the credence of any testimony or evidence given by those people in the court, if there was some aspect of racism in the case that those testimonies and evidence given wasn't taken as effective because it came from Aboriginal people.
I'll repeat the question for the recording. The question is, what role, if any, did Aboriginal Australians play in testifying during the trial, and how was that evidence, for instance, the evidence from the Aboriginal Australian trackers on the night the child was taken, how was that evidence received by the court and by the jury?
At the first and, of course, successful coronial inquiry, the coroner did invite the trackers to make an appearance and to give evidence. The senior tracker and the elder of the Pigeon and Jara people, the local people, did give evidence, and it ran into trouble because of a cultural requirement, which really the rules of admissibility couldn't properly cope with. That was that the elder who gave the evidence wasn't there. And because of his standing, he was the only one entitled to give the evidence. The tracker who had found the evidentially worthy marks was his junior minion Terry, who would not give evidence because it wasn't his place to give evidence. There was a second reason that the cultural differences were destructive of justice, really. And that was that the coroner had heard of happenings in which babies, Aboriginal babies, had been taken by dingoes. And since the case was proceeding on the basis that this was an entirely novel idea and therefore really unreliable, when Marty, the elder, was embarrassed when he was asked about this because it involved some sacredness, particularly a suggestion that in the event, because it's harsh country, it doesn't make living easy for anybody in this country. And so the practice had grown up that in the event of twins being born, they would be placed outside and a dingo would take the least fit, the least strong. There is some anthropological reports of this, but I still can't think of it being wonderfully reliable yet. But it embarrassed Win Marty to have to even address such a topic. Consequently, at the next inquest, which was to overrule the favourable inquest, and was really a shamefully arranged and improper procedure. That coroner had used that excuse as for not calling calling any of the Aboriginal people to give evidence.
So again, another example of the complexities of this case, and again, complexities that we see in many criminal prosecutions. I know we have a number of students who have to get to class, so we'll end there, but I know that Mr. Bryson will be available for questions afterwards. Please join me in thanking John Bryson for being here.